Now turn to Section 3 on page 114. Test 5, Section 3. In this section, you will hear an interview with a wildlife specialist called Alison Sharp talking about bears. In the first part of the discussion, they are talking about the history of the bear. First, look at questions 21 to 23. Now listen to the first part of the interview and answer questions 21 to 23.
Alison Sharp has spent much of her life researching bears, and in particular, bears in danger of extinction. She is the author of a recent book on bears, and we welcome her to the studio today.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
First of all, can you give us a quick overview of the history of the bear family?
Well, the bears we know today actually have as their ancestors bears which have been evolving for some 40 million years. We have fossils of the earliest true bear, and it's important to emphasize this because some creatures are called bears but are not.
Such as koalas, for instance.
Yes, exactly. Fossils of the true bear show a small dog-sized animal with characteristics that show a blending of dog and bear traits.
So the general belief is that dogs and bears were of the same family?
Yes, that's the theory. And then we see the arrival of the early cave bear. We know from cave drawings that Neanderthal man used to worship this bear and at the same time fear it.
Understandable, perhaps.
Yes, but they need not have worried because the cave bear only ate plants. In fact, the cave bear survived 2 ice ages, but then became extinct.
In the second part of the interview, Alison talks more about the situation of bears today. Look at questions 24 to 30 first. Listen carefully and answer questions 24 to 30.
So, how many bears can we find today? And are any of them in danger of extinction?
Well, I'll answer your first question first. There are 8 species of bear in all, among them the American black bear and the brown bear, from which evolved the newest species of bear, the polar bear.
So, how old is the polar bear?
Oh, he's a relative newcomer, just 20,000 years old.
And could you tell us a little about them? Which is the largest bear, for instance?
Well, the largest bear existing today is either the polar bear or the brown bear.
Right. Don't we know?
Well, it depends which criteria you use. The polar bear is the heaviest. The male weighs up to 1,500 pounds, but his narrow body actually makes him look smaller than the much more robust brown bear.
So the brown bear appears the biggest?
Yes.
And the smallest?
Well, the sun bear is the smallest of the 8 species. They only weigh between 60 and 145 pounds.
That makes him a comparative junior.
Yes. And then next we have the so-called giant panda. But that's a small bear too, comparatively speaking.
And are all bears meat eaters?
No, not at all. In fact, the giant panda is almost entirely herbivorous, living on a diet of 30 types of bamboo.
Ah, yes, of course. Pandas are famous for that.
And another interesting bear is the sloth bear, which eats insects, particularly termites. He can turn his mouth into a tube and suck the insects out of their nests.
So, going back to my second question, are bears really in danger of extinction?
Yes, indeed, they are. The sun bear in particular, as they've been hunted almost out of existence. And the habitat of the panda is also being reduced on a daily basis.
Can anything be done to reduce the threat to these endangered species? I know, for instance, that it's very hard to breed bears in captivity.
Yes. Well, I think that by raising people's awareness generally, we can reduce conflict between humans and animals, to stop the slaughter in parts of the world where bears are still hunted, supposedly in self-defense or to protect livestock, but often quite unnecessarily. And we can also encourage governments to preserve the natural environment of the bear, rather than allow the areas where they live to be systematically destroyed in the name of progress.
Yes, of course.
And in addition to these global efforts, all profits from the sale of my book will go toward the United Nations Bear Protection Program.
That's wonderful. And with the news coming up, thank you for your time, Alison, and best of luck with the book.
Thank you very much.
That is the end of section 3. You now have half a minute to check your answers. Now turn to section 4 on page 116. Test 5, section 4. You will hear a lecturer talking about the solar eclipse in history. First, you have some time to look at questions 31 to 36. Now listen carefully and answer questions 31 to 36.
Good evening, and welcome to this month's Observatory Club lecture. I'm Donald Mackey, and I'm here to talk to you about the solar eclipse in history. 1,000 years ago, a total eclipse of the sun was a terrifying religious experience. But these days, an eclipse is more likely to be viewed as a tourist attraction than as a scientific or spiritual event. People will travel literally miles to be in the right place at the right time to get the best view of their eclipse. Well, what exactly causes a solar eclipse when the world goes dark for a few minutes in the middle of the day? Scientifically speaking, the dark spot itself is easy to explain. It's the shadow of the moon streaking across the Earth. This happens every year or two, each time along a different, and to all intents and purposes, a seemingly random piece of the globe. In the past, people often interpreted an eclipse as a danger signal heralding disaster, and in fact the Chinese were so disturbed by these events that they included among their gods one whose job it was to prevent eclipses. But whether or not you're superstitious or take a purely scientific view, our earthly eclipses are special in 3 ways. Firstly, there can be no doubt that they're very beautiful. It's as if a deep blue curtain had fallen over the daytime sky as the sun becomes a black void surrounded by the glow of its outer atmosphere. But beyond this, total eclipses possess a second, more compelling beauty in the eyes of us scientists, for they offer a unique opportunity for research. Only during an eclipse can we study the corona and other dim things that are normally lost in the sun's glare. And thirdly, they are rare. Even though an eclipse of the sun occurs somewhere on Earth every year or two, if you sit in your garden and wait, it will take 375 years on average for one to come to you. If the moon were any larger, eclipses would become a monthly bore. If it were smaller, they simply would not be possible. The ancient Babylonian priests, who spent a fair bit of time staring at the sky, had already noted that there was an 18-year pattern in their occurrence, but they didn't have the mathematics to predict an eclipse accurately.
In the second part, the speaker talks about a number of scientists. Look at questions 37 to 40. Now listen carefully and complete the table.
It was Edmund Halley, the English astronomer, who knew his maths well enough to predict the return of the comet, which incidentally bears his name, and in 1715 he became the first person to make an accurate eclipse prediction. This brought eclipses firmly into the scientific domain, and they've since allowed a number of important scientific discoveries to be made. For instance, in the eclipse of 1868, two scientists, Janssen and Lockyer, were observing the sun's atmosphere, and it was these observations that ultimately led to the discovery of a new element. They named the element helium, after the Greek god of the sun. This was a major find, because helium turned out to be the most common element in the universe after hydrogen. Another great triumph involved mercury. I'll just put that up on the board for you now. See, there's Mercury, the planet closest to the sun, then Venus, Earth, etc. For centuries, scientists had been unable to understand why Mercury appeared to rotate faster than it should. Some astronomers suggested that there might be an undiscovered planet causing this unusual orbit, and even gave it the name Vulcan. During the eclipse of 1878, an American astronomer, James Watson, thought he'd spotted this so-called lost planet. But, alas for him, he was later obliged to admit that he'd been wrong about Vulcan and withdrew his claim. Then Albert Einstein came on the scene. Einstein suggested that, rather than being wrong about the number of planets, astronomers were actually wrong about gravity. Einstein's theory of relativity, for which he's so famous, disagreed with Newton's law of gravity in just the right way to explain Mercury's odd orbit. He also realized that a definitive test would be possible during the total eclipse of 1919, and this is indeed when his theory was finally proved correct. So there you have several examples of how eclipses have helped to increase our understanding of the universe. And now let's move on to the social aspects, and I think you'll find...
That is the end of section 4. You now have half a minute to check your answers.